Welcome back, members of the jury. Before we proceed with Mr. King's cross-examination, I want to remind you folks that the court has admitted Dr. Reed's testimony only for a limited purpose. You may consider Dr. Reed's testimony only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. All right, Mr. Reed, you may proceed. Doctor, I remind you that you're still under oath.
Doctor, Mr. Holmes remains on that antipsychotic medication today, as far as you know, is that right?
So far as I know, yes.
And it's not your recommendation that he should be taken off that medication, is it?
No, it is not.
Then you would probably have an ethical problem with that, would you not?
Yes, he needs the necessary treatment determined by his clinicians, and that's the way I see it.
So it seems to have helped him in some regard. Fair to say?
It seems to have helped him in some regard. He is substantially better than he was in November of 2012. That's the most I can say.
And you recall that when Dr. Fenton saw him back in May and June of 2012, that she wanted to prescribe him an antipsychotic medication as well, or she suggested that to him.
Yes, she did.
And it was during that period of time that she wrote in her notes that Mr. Holmes was exhibiting a psychotic level of thinking, correct?
She was at least suspicious of that and concerned about it, yes.
I'm going to try to move things along here, sir. You asked some questions about anger relating to the hatred of mankind that phrase that he wrote in his notebook, right?
Yes.
And he said that he never told anybody he was angry, right?
In the context of the shootings, I believe you're correct. I'm not sure about any context at all.
Right, not his whole entire life, but in the context of the shooting, that it wasn't done out of anger towards anyone.
That has been his consistent statement.
He has indicated that he wasn't angry at the folks at CU, correct?
That he has said that consistently, yes.
And that he wasn't angry at any of the people in the theater.
That particularly he has been consistent about saying.
And he described this hatred of mankind as just an intense aversion of either people or of being around people, one or the other.
That's the way he's described it, yes.
You were asked a direct examination about something that was in Dr. Gurr's report regarding a master power. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes, I do.
And Mr. Brockler asked you, and I think this is the quote, now do you remember that Dr. Gurr actually wrote in her report that he was being controlled by a master power? And you said yes, right?
At least that was my recollection. We can go to her report if you like.
Okay. Well, maybe we can speed it up if I just read to you what she actually wrote in her report on page 9.
Sure.
Which is, when looking in the mirror, he saw another guy. And she's talking to him in the context of the contact lenses, the possession lenses he had, and the other regalia. When looking in the mirror, he saw another guy and had a sense that something, a master power, had taken over. Do you recall that being the correct
That sounds
statement?
familiar, yes.
Now, when you asked Mr. Holmes about the nature of that subject, he indicated or told you that he felt like he had two selves, kind of. Remember that line?
There were one or two times when he referred to at least two parts of himself, and he at some point said, it feels like I have two selves.
And you followed up on that, and you didn't determine that there were like two multiple personalities or anything like that, and he didn't claim that, did he?
You're correct.
It was more like two parts of himself struggling with one another.
Yes.
Say?
Yes.
We talked a lot about Mr. Holmes thinking that he was being followed by the police, things like that you thought might be paranoia or might not, fair to say?
Fair to say.
Paranoid delusions are fairly common as delusions go. Is that correct?
As delusions go, the ones that someone's after me or following me or watching me are among the most common.
Are you aware of any evidence in the record of the case that the FBI, the police, or any other law enforcement agency was on to Mr. Holmes? That they knew what he was going to do?
No, I'm not aware of any of that, and I looked for that a bit, and the answer is no.
Are you aware of whether or not any law enforcement agency was surveilling him, following him around, parking cars near his apartment?
So far as I know, they were not surveilling him. They may have been parking cars near his apartment, but so far as I know, it had nothing to do with him.
So any belief on his part that he was in fact being followed by the police or that the FBI was on to him was a false belief then, as far as you know?
It was at least mistaken, yes.
Now, he also said that he saw a FBI vehicle at the shooting range that he went to. Is that right?
Either there or driving by, yes.
And he indicated to you that he knew it was an FBI vehicle because it was an SUV and it said FBI on the side.
He indicated that, yes.
Do you know where the closest FBI office is to Byers Canyon?
I don't know.
Are you aware of whether the FBI drives around in SUVs or other vehicles that actually say FBI on the side of the vehicle?
I'm not aware one way or another, particularly in this area.
Are you aware of any credible evidence in the record that the FBI, that there was actually an FBI vehicle parked at that gun range?
At the time that I wrote my report, I believed that someone with authority had told me, yes, there really was a vehicle out there. I've looked and looked and looked to verify that. I've not been able to verify it in the records or in my notes. And so I have, although I stated in the report that it was a real vehicle, I can't confirm that as I sit here.
There's no indication in the record that there was actually an FBI vehicle there. In other words, the Maples, the couple that was the caretaker that summer of the gun range, that one of them has testified here. You don't recall any of them ever saying that there was an FBI vehicle at that gun range, do you?
I don't recall as I sit here, and once again, if it's there, it's there. But when I looked for it again, I did not find it.
You talked about when he went to visit Fenton and Feinstein, and he thought it was very suspicious that there was a suspicious package behind her chair and that she locked the door, correct?
That was in connection, I think that was the session after she had made a mistake with a prescription. On that particular day, her door was locked in what may have been an unusual way. That is, the front door, frequently if one doesn't have a secretary, you keep the outside door locked. When he eventually went in, he was concerned about the door being locked. That is, he thought there was some meaning to that. When he went in, he noticed a box or a bag behind her desk and thought that might have something in it to protect her from him. And I believe in the same session, so this may not have been right after the prescription, in the same session, Dr. Feinstein was wearing a sling or a cast of some kind, and he believed that that had some meaning related to him, none of which was true according to Drs. Fenton and Feinstein.
Do you remember when you talked to Fenton and Feinstein on the phone, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And do you remember when you talked to Dr. Feinstein that he said at first that he didn't remember having a sling on, but then I think he called you back and said, oh yeah, I do?
He did. He called me back, or either he or Dr. Fenton called me back and said, yes, as a matter of fact, I did.
If you'll forgive me, I'm going to try to move forward to move this along here. You talked quite a bit in your opinions about the planning, and in your sanity section of your report, you list a lot of the reasons or the bases for your opinion on capacity, and it has a lot to do with the planning and what you call logical goal-oriented activities. Is that right? Is that
That's
fair?
part of it, yes.
And what you're talking about are things like purchasing the weapons, purchasing and assembling the components for the alleged incendiary devices in the apartment, correct?
That's part of it, yes.
And you, as far as that goes, you're not an incendiary or explosive expert. You don't know if those were wired up correctly or not, or if it would work or not. But it looked pretty complicated and put together to you, right?
I only know what other people have reported and what Mr. Holmes has said about it. I'm not an expert in incendiary devices.
But nevertheless, you thought it was a logical activity because it was a distraction to help him to accomplish his mission, right?
Based on what he said and the logic of what he said about it, yes.
You felt the same way about, I think you put the word surreptitious in your report in the Sandy section, that his planning was surreptitious, that he hid it in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Now, in a lot of ways he didn't, too. I mean, he, as you pointed out, didn't use a proxy server. He used all his own bank accounts, credit cards, his own apartment. True? All those things are true?
All those things are true.
But he didn't tell anybody, correct?
Correct.
All of those activities are logical in the sense that they would help facilitate the accomplishment of the mission. Is that right?
That's right.
And that's what you mean by goal-oriented.
It's one of the things. It's a broad part of goal-oriented. There are little pieces that are goal-oriented as well for different goals and objectives, but yes.
You would agree with me that the mission itself is not logical.
It is not logical with regard to what society thinks about what you should do. It is not logical with regard to bringing him money, what some folks might call rational motives. You're correct.
In other words, a rational motive for a crime might be anger, vengeance, wanting money, any number of things. Is that right?
Yes.
Wanting to commit a crime in order to increase your value is not rational, correct?
That's correct.
So these are all rational, goal-directed activities directed at completing an irrational goal, correct?
That's pretty close to correct. It may appear slightly more rational that he thought his depression would get better. That, I believe that's irrational, by the way. And the third thing that does have with what you described as something like vengeance or anger, he talked about a small portion of the goal, and this is after the fact, having to do with his aversion to mankind, his phrase hatred of mankind, but he consistently said that was a small part of it.
Very small part, right? I think
Yes.
he said 10% or something.
I think he said 10%. I wouldn't hold him to some number, but it was a small part.
And killing other people to alleviate your depression is not rational, correct?
I agree.
Now, he told you in the theater that he didn't make he wasn't, strike that. Can I play a video clip from the examination?
Yes.
The jury? It's only like an hour and 45 minutes long.
As long as you keep it under 2 hours, you may.
No, it's really not very long at all. It's like a minute long, I think, or something like that.
All right, go ahead. Mr.
20?
I don't know the other number.
Oh. No sound. I can try to do the ventriloquist thing. Let me try starting it again, perhaps.
It was not my intentions to be locked up, no.
What do you think the chances were of your not being locked up?
Very slim. So I knew I was going to be locked up, but that doesn't mean I wanted to be locked up.
That kind of begs the question, so why did you do something that would make it virtually certain you'd be locked up or killed?
That's just the price you have to pay for completing the mission.
And the benefit of completing the mission is?
Increasing my self-worth.
Mr. Holmes indicated to you that being locked up wasn't so great, right?
At that point, yes.
And that he didn't want to be locked up, correct?
That's what he said at that point.
But it was just the price you have to pay for completing the mission, correct?
That's what he said.
And so you ask him what the benefit of the mission is, and he says, to increase my self-worth, right?
Yes.
You asked him about anger again. Are you angry when you're doing these things, buying the gun and tear gas? What are you thinking? And he says, I'm thinking, quote, that I have a mission to complete. Right?
I think that's in there. I don't recall the specific words, but it's very consistent, yes.
He said there's no anger. It was something that I had to do. Correct?
I'm sure you're reading it correctly.
He said, quote, like I was obligated to do it. There was no alternative to do something else.
I
Correct?
recall words very similar to that, yes.
Can I have clip 24? I'm sorry if I don't have the right number, ma'am.
You stopped seeing them at some point, and I'm trying to think of the order of the appointments. You kept every appointment that was made, as I recall.
Yeah.
Okay. But at the last appointment, you communicated in some way that this was going to be the last
This was the
appointment.
last one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as I recall, even left a little early. This is it. Is it accurate?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
accurate.
Why did you make that your last appointment?
I don't know why.
If there was a wish to fix you or to, on the one hand, fix things, fix your mind, and on the other hand, prevent the mission from taking place, prevent the track that things were on, to stop that.
Yeah, it kind of overruled the treatment.
It overruled the treatment.
Yeah.
Pretty strong force.
Yep.
Where does such a strong force come from?
I don't know. It just took hold of my mind.
I'm sorry?
Took hold of my mind.
Took hold of your mind. There are some pretty strong forces that take hold of people's minds sometimes. The impulse to drink for alcoholics, to shoot up for heroin addicts, to do other things.
Yep.
Any thoughts about why this took such irrevocable hold of your mind, such unbeatable hold of your mind?
I don't know why it dominated, but it did.
But it did, such a thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you think of any other ways to stop it?
Well, at that point, I was more concerned with going through with it than stopping it.
Going through with it, the picture in your mind was that everything was going to end with the mission. That is, you didn't plan beyond the mission. It sounds as if, and once again, correct me if I'm wrong, that nothing existed for you of import beyond the mission.
Right.
Okay.
Members of the jury, let me remind you that the defendant's statements on the video recording, including any clips of the video recording, have been admitted only for a limited purpose. You may consider the defendant's statements on the video recording only as to the issues raised by his plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider them for any other purpose. Dr. Reed's statements on the video recording may only be considered for the limited purpose of allowing you to assess the reliability of his examination and to provide context to the statements made in the video recording by the defendant. You shall not consider any statements made by Dr. Reed on the video recording for any other purpose, including for the truth of their content or as evidence of what was said in those statements or what was contained in those statements. All right, with that instruction, Mr. King, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. In that clip, he indicates, he, being Mr. Holmes, indicates that the mission overruled the treatment and, quote, just took hold of my mind. And then you try to dig down on that a little bit. Is that a fair representation of what you're trying to do there?
Sure, or clarify, sure.
And you ask why? Why? You're asking the why question. Why did that take such irrevocable, such unbeatable hold on your mind? And he says, I don't know why it dominated, but it did. Right?
That's what he says.
You were asked about a portion of Dr. Gurr's report where she talked about Mr. Holmes indicating that the world was going to end, or there would be an end, or something along those lines. You understand that?
I was asked about that, yes.
In that video clip, at the end of that clip, you say it sounds like nothing else existed for you of import beyond the mission. And he agrees with that, right?
That's right.
There was no plan of his that he told you about of an escape plan, is that right?
At other times, he talked about possibilities of escape, but that wasn't a big part of anything in this planning that he's described.
He hadn't formulated an actual plan, is that right?
Except for the little things in the car, you're correct.
And he thought that it was almost a certainty that he would either die or be locked up in jail.
He has said that several times, yes.
And he didn't want to be locked up in jail, right? He said that in the previous clip.
He may have, okay, that's what he said then.
During you asked him about the after Christmas when he came back to graduate school, and he indicated to you that he was during that period of time trying to keep it together. And you asked him, trying to keep your mind together? It sounds like you're talking about trying to keep your mind together. And he said to you, that sounds accurate. Do you remember that?
If it's what's in the transcript, then it's very likely accurate.
Do you remember asking about Hillary Allen? And he went on a date with Hillary Allen, or a hike or something like that. Is that right?
Yes.
And you said it was fairly normal for young men to ask out young women from time to time, and that wasn't anything that seemed really abnormal. Fair to say?
Fair to say he had kind of flirted with her in texts, and they eventually went out.
Do you remember him telling you that after that hike that she asked to see if we wanted to do anything else, but by that time I had red hair and was kind of out of it? Do you remember that exchange?
I don't remember the specific exchange, but I recall that they didn't do much more, and I do recall that she explored doing something more, but nothing ever happened.
And he didn't want to, because he said he wanted to protect her from being involved with someone who was going to be a murderer.
Yes, eventually that's what he texted her, or IM'd, or whatever they call it nowadays.
So at that point in time, well, he indicates he's kind of out of it. So I'll move on. And it was during that period of time that they have the exchange, the message exchange between the two of them, where he talks about dysphoric mania. Do you remember that?
It's around then. I don't remember the particular chronology, but it's around then, I believe.
And I'm not going to bother to actually show you the message now, but do you remember that essentially the gravamen of the message is that he says to her, have you ever heard of dysphoric mania? And she says, yeah, why? Or why? And he says, because that's what I've got. You remember that?
Words to that effect, yes.
And he wrote that in the notebook, too, that was one of the things he thought he had.
Yes.
And she says, you know, I've had some tough times, too, or something like that. I've been through some stuff, too, and is it controllable? Can you deal with it? And he says, I used to be able to, but not anymore. The floodgates are open.
I remember the floodgates are open and the context, yes.
You talked with Mr. Holmes quite a bit on several different occasions about being remembered with regard to the photographs, the selfie photographs that he took. Do you recall
Yes.
that? And I think that you said that, in your opinion, that was consistent with capacity because it was logical, goal-oriented activity as well, that other people do things like that. Was that right, or am I misunderstanding you?
Something like that. It's not the whole picture, but it doesn't, in my view, move at all toward lack of capacity.
Can you tell me what goal-oriented, rational behavior Mr. Holmes actually did to get other people to see those photographs? Did he publish them in the newspaper or send it to the newspaper?
He thought about it but did not. He put, excuse me, some sort of photograph on some sort of match, maybe some match online service, but not the ones with the regalia, so far as I know. He left them on his phone.
Where was his phone?
I don't know.
And they were on his computer too, right? Or do you know?
You know, I do know that they were because it appeared that he emailed them to himself.
And the computer he left in the apartment.
That's my understanding.
He didn't post them on Facebook or Twitter or anything like that?
Unless something went to the thing called Squarespace, you're in general correct. And if there's an exception, I'll stand corrected.
He did post one of the pictures on a Squarespace web page that he created. Is that right?
Something like that.
Are you aware that that was a web page that was not able to be accessed by anyone else?
When he was asked about it, he couldn't explain how other people would get to it. So I'll accept what you say. Well, let me just say I don't know.
When you asked how he would be remembered, he said that he would be remembered, well, one of the things he said was he would be remembered in a poor light. Is that right?
At one point, that's one of the things he said.
If I can have a moment, Your Honor, I'm almost to the end here.
Okay.
Finally, sir, I think you testified on direct that asking for speculation by Mr. Holmes was one of was a technique that you used. Am I remembering that correctly?
Something like that, sure.
Tell me about that.
It's very standard fare in any psychological or psychiatric examination, including some of the written psychological tests, to ask things like, what do you think about such and such, or can you expand on such and such, or would you think about that for me, and then very similarly, would you speculate about that for me?
And those most often came in instances, and the videotape speaks for itself, and the jury can evaluate this, but most often those came in instances when you asked him a question and he said, I don't know, something along those lines, and you said, well, speculate for me, right?
Yes, the idea of trying to get him to talk more instead of less.
And that was a difficulty. He's not a real talker, fair to say?
Fair to say.
There were also a number of things that you interjected into the conversation.
Yes, there were.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Is that a technique that you use as well, or?
It's a technique that I use, and I try to tell him, as I did several times on the video, this is my thought, it doesn't have to be your thought, or that makes me think of A or B. Does that seem accurate? It's a way to, in a sense, show him a screen that may be related to his thinking or to his statement, and see what he says, whether he agrees or not. And that's the technique. It's a common technique.
So you brought up with him a number of things. You brought up with him, you mentioned to him the Inception movie at some point. Do you remember that?
Yes.
You brought up the You talked to him about if I can have a moment, Judge.
Yes,
I've lost my place.
take your time.
There we go. You bring up to him at one point the dancing Wu Li Masters,
Yes.
and he didn't know what that was about.
No, that was kind of a flyer on my part that didn't go anywhere.
And you brought up string theory at one point. Is that right?
At one point, related to some of the concepts he was talking about.
At one point, he's talking about having a pact to not hate his mom, and you bring up the fact that some people have a pact with themselves not to masturbate. Is that right?
Yes.
You brought up with him a number of times a suggestion that his sister had abandoned him, correct?
Yes, or at least wanting him to consider whether or not she had.
May I have a moment, Judge?
You may.
One more question, sir. During the course of your examination of Mr. Holmes, he was cooperative with you, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
He did, other than the question about his penis, he didn't refuse to answer any questions. Is that right?
There were many that he had difficulty answering or didn't answer, but he did not say, I'm not going to answer that at any other time.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
All right. Do you have any redirect?
Yes, I do, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, you may proceed.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to start where Mr. King left off last night, okay?
Okay.
Do you remember the question that was posed to you was, but for the defendant's mental illness, whatever that may be, this crime wouldn't have been committed and we wouldn't have been in this room. Do you remember that?
I remember that.
Tell us, are you saying that this mental illness caused the crime and caused us to be in this room?
Without the mental illness, we wouldn't be here, just as without his moving to Colorado, we wouldn't be here, or without his being accepted for the grad school, we wouldn't be here.
Well, let me go a little bit further. But for his girlfriend dumping him, and maybe had she still been in a nurturing, long-lasting relationship through May, June, and July, could we say that this wouldn't have happened?
I wouldn't go so far. He was planning pretty carefully. Anything's possible. Certain things may have changed, but I don't think that was a big part of why he did this.
But for his conclusion that he had no career in science.
It's part of the overall picture. I don't believe, once I say anything's possible, I don't believe that his ending up with that thought, particularly as of June, that would have stopped what was already started.
In terms of there is nothing else that would have stopped this.
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, I guess I'm asking, look, if his girlfriend's with him and they're in a long-term nurturing relationship through May, June, and July, is he able to pull this off?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
And forgive me, Your Honor, I'm asking in the context of his but-for analysis.
Rephrase the question.
in terms of this but-for analysis, but for his girlfriend not being close to him and in a nurturing relationship through May and June and July as he planned for this massacre, it might not have happened, right?
Objection. Asked and answered. Leading.
It's not asked and answered. It's a little different than the question that was asked and answered. So that objection is overruled. It is leading, so I'll sustain it on leading, but you can rephrase the question.
I get it. I think I know where we're going. In your report, the one that the question got asked from yesterday, talk to us about whether or not you think there's a direct causality between the mental illness and the voluntariness of the defendant's actions on July 19th and July 20th.
Okay. I do not believe there is a direct connection between the mental illness and the voluntariness. I believe there is a substantial relationship between the presence of the mental illness and the eventual carrying out of the event.
And in part, it's because his desire to murder was something that we've determined was delusional.
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
Is it because part of his, or a big part of his motivation to want to murder was something that we've determined was, or you've determined was delusional?
Some part of it was, and if I'm understanding your question right, that's related.
Understood.
But my main thing that I think goes to this is that the mental disorder that I believe he has affected the course of events. It did not affect, in my opinion, his capacity to voluntarily or knowingly, the capacity to do those things.
And when you say capacity, are you talking about the capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality?
Yes.
And the capacity to form the intent to murder after deliberation and to act knowingly in setting up the booby traps in his apartment?
Yes.
The mental illness didn't impact that.
It
Didn't interfere with it.
Objection. Leading.
It's a follow-up to the question that has already been answered, overruled. Go ahead.
It did not interfere with that, in my opinion.
There was considerable discussion about things that took place months after the defendant was taken into custody on this case. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Tell us the impact of what happened in November of 2012 has on an assessment of his capacity to know right from wrong and to be able to form the intent to kill after deliberation and knowingly set up booby traps in his apartment back in July of 2012.
It has no impact, in my opinion.
Is it something that helps with a conversation about a diagnosis, potentially?
It potentially helps with a conversation about diagnosis, yes.
Some small things about that. You were referred by Mr. King to a CAT scan that the defendant received after he appears to have run headlong into the wall. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you remember there being no signs of injury on that CAT scan?
I recall that I remember words to that effect, yes.
Okay. You talked about a delirium that precipitated or preceded some of these psychotic symptoms that we saw. Talk to us about that.
One of the early and primary diagnoses when he got to Denver Health Medical Center was that Mr. Holmes was in the midst of a delirium. A delirium is a disconnect with reality that's not the same as the psychosis one sees in, for example, schizophrenia or sometimes in schizotypal disorder. The delirium has to do with a metabolic upset in the brain and has certain characteristics that are different and generally diagnosably different from the, let me call it, schizophreniform psychosis. There appear to have been both in November. The main thing that people addressed first, I believe, was the delirium, probably in part because that is physically more dangerous.
We're talking about events that took place months later. In the intervening months, you were asked a question about the defendant standing up and saying he may be trying to cause a fire in some way with his life. Do you recall that conversation?
I recall the conversation.
Do you recall at this point, and I can revisit this after the break, but do you recall at this point log notes indicating that the defendant had disassembled a handicap bar in his cell to use as a club?
I don't recall those notes.
Do you recall him using his toothpaste cap to take off an electric plate from the wall?
I recall some discussion about his trying to take off some kind of covering plate on the wall. I don't recall his using the toothpaste cap to do it.
Or a fork, a plastic fork?
Not that I don't recall that.
Other than those types of things that we have talked about here, did you see anything in there that suggested that during that period of time the defendant was going through some sort of psychotic break?
Not up until, give or take, November 11, 2012.
As long as we're talking about November of 2012, what significance is there to how quickly he responded to medications after he went to Denver?
Several things can be inferred from that. One is that delirium, when the cause of the delirium is fixed, such as rehydration or something like that, correction of the metabolic deficit, the delirium ordinarily clears quickly. The second is that a first break psychosis particularly, it can occur with second break psychoses as well, often responds well to rapid and vigorous treatment when the psychosis is not characteristic of the chronic illness. It is often the case, more likely than not the case in my opinion, that the psychosis clears quickly once you give treatment. When the diagnosis is a schizophrenic diagnosis, it may clear quickly, or it may not clear as quickly. The person tends, this is a matter of statistics, not a matter of individuals, tends to not come back to the baseline that he or she had for a while.
And how does it appear to you, based on your review of the records, how the defendant was doing in the weeks and months subsequent to the November incident versus prior to the November incident?
After the incident, the video of him, I think a week or so later, that the defense supplied, indicated he was improved. One can't tell too much about how he was, but he was improved. Dr. Gurr's evaluation of him in late December or mid-December indicated that he, I want to say she saw him as more seriously disturbed than I believe I saw him 6 months later. As I saw him 6 months later, first in July of, 18 months later, in July of 2014, he looked, I was not surprised with the way I found him because it seemed similar to the way he had been described earlier. Now, I can't say he was not better than he was after the event. He was, I think, more conversant than is described after the event. The improvement since the arrest I see as perhaps measurable, but not all that great. The improvement since the November 2012 psychotic break was quite substantial improvement.
Again, any of that have an impact on your assessment of his capacity to know right from wrong and to form the intent to murder on July the 19th and 20th of 2012?
No.
Now, there was a ton of discussion in detail about DSM-5 with you as it relates to diagnosis. Do you agree with that?
There was
Object to the characterization of the question.
Overruled?
There was a lot of discussion.
So, and you were asked, in fact, to even read some portions from the DSM-5?
I think so, or from my report that were taken from the DSM-5.
And do you remember Mr. King reading some portions of the DSM-5 to you?
Yes, and I was indeed, I remember now, asked to read specific parts from DSM-5.
I'm going to direct you to, do you have a DSM-5 up there?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, would you take a look at page 101? This is under the diagnosis for schizophrenia. Is that fair, on the page before?
Yes, it is.
The last full paragraph, last sentence. Should be noted that the vast majority of persons with schizophrenia are not aggressive and are more frequently victimized than are individuals in the general population.
Yes.
Why is that?
I don't see a why to it. It's simply a fact that if you look at all the people with schizophrenia, for example, in this country, and look at their interactions with the law or reports of violence and things like that, as a group, given the schizophrenia alone, they're not particularly a violent group, and yet far more often, as one might imagine, the deficits in their schizophrenia cause them to be vulnerable to all kinds of victimization and difficulties in life.
Now, we keep talking about schizophrenia, so I want to ask you, are there several hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia?
There are.
Are there any related to whether someone is aware that they're sick?
It is unusual that a person who has not been in treatment is aware that he has something like schizophrenia, something seriously wrong. People who have been in treatment for a while or who have talked with therapists, psychiatrists, etc. for a while often will agree that they have it. They may know the name of the diagnosis. It's unusual for somebody to come in and say for the first time, I need help because I have schizophrenia or because I'm hearing things, seeing things, something like that. Usually somebody else gets them to help.
Yeah, more often than not, how do they see themselves in relation to everybody else?
As not unusual. They may agree that they're not being as successful as someone else, but they don't see themselves, and this is speaking as a group, not as individuals, they don't see themselves as the sick people.
There was you were actually even asked to read a certain portion of page 87. Can you take a look at that? And I can't remember the defense exhibit that it was.
Yes.
All right. Under hallucinations, which is one of the potential factors for schizophrenia?
And other things, yes.
Yeah, of course. What's the most common form of hallucination in schizophrenia?
Auditory hallucinations, that is, hearing voices from people that aren't there.
And did you find any evidence of that at all before November of 2012?
No.
Now, Mr. King asked you about an exchange you had in the video where he talked about hearing his own voice inside of his head. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Is that an audio hallucination?
As he described it, and I carefully tried to make sure one way or the other, it was not an auditory hallucination.
Is part of it because the auditory hallucination has to be distinct from the individual's own thoughts?
Yes.
Can we take a look at delusions on that page?
Sure.
Last sentence. The distinction between a delusion and a strongly held idea is sometimes difficult to make and depends in part on the degree of conviction which with the belief is held, despite clear or reasonable contradictory evidence regarding its veracity. You agree with that?
Yes.
Is that part of the standard that you're thinking about when you're trying to determine if the defendant's belief in increased self-value is delusional?
Yes.
So let me ask you that. Again, I touched upon this yesterday, but in light of this conversation, I have another question, and that is, other than us disagreeing with a value system that makes someone feel better or get some abstract theoretical value by killing people, what is the clear or reasonable contradictory evidence that could be presented to the defendant to disabuse him of the notion that he values himself more based on the number of dead bodies he creates?
Objection, Judge. Calls for speculation.
Well, I think he's asking for his opinion in terms of the subject of delusions. So if you can answer, Doctor, in that context, not in the context of some specific factual scenario, but in the context of delusions in general.
It's nice when we can show that something is not true. You think the refrigerator is your mother, we can pretty much show that and see if the person agrees. I don't know a way in this context to combat that belief except to say that it doesn't make sense to me or other people.
Because we don't have any way to provide him with clear or reasonable contradictory evidence about what he subjectively believes.
That's true, but I wouldn't use that as a big part of reasoning about whether or not it's a delusion. Our failure to find something to dissuade him doesn't, to me, determine whether or not it's a delusion.
Again, when we talk about that, and you've talked about, hey, it'd be great if we could disprove it. The delusions that we come across, they tend to be factual, or are they abstract theoretical like this, in your experience?
It varies.
Now, if we had, I want to ask you a hypothetical in your opinion. We have someone who thinks every time I kill someone, $1 million will show up in my bank account. Okay? Is that a delusion?
If it's firmly held and held for a while and not just a thought or a wish, that's very likely to be a delusion.
The fact that there is that delusion, does that mean that that person, if they engage in the act of murder, doesn't know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality?
It does not mean that.
Does it mean that they lack the ability to form the intent to murder after deliberation?
It does not mean that.
I mean, what if this is, I mean, they're like, gosh, I really want $1 million. I really want $1 million, so actually I want $10 million. So I'm going to go out and kill 10 people. I really want $10 million. Does that change your answer to any of the capacity questions?
No, it doesn't, and it raises, I think, a difference between, it raises the idea of a wish to do something and struggling with whether I should or not. We do that every day, whether it's having an extra dessert or buying an expensive car or something else. That does not go to the capacity, in my opinion, to know that something is wrong or to know that I shouldn't do it.
I want to build on Mr. King's reference to my Bieber thing and ask you, let's take that person, let's not make it me this time. How about that? Let's just make it someone named Ed, okay? Ed really likes Justin Bieber, thinks there's a connection with him, just like Mr. King says. He goes out and he buys all of his albums. He knows he's coming to town. He buys several concert tickets to try to get the front row to himself because he wants to have some alone time with Justin Bieber. It gets to the point where he decides, you know what, I don't want to have to share Justin Bieber with others. So he spends 2 months plotting the murder of everyone at that concert so that he can have Justin Bieber to himself. 1, is that belief and interest in that Bieber connection and pursuing it one-on-one, is that delusional?
The way you describe it, I would say it's likely not to be delusional because you're not describing him thinking Justin and I have a relationship that's not there. The way you're describing it is I have a real strong impulse, I have a wish, I have a want, and I'm going to carry it out regardless of whether it's right or wrong.
Then let me make it clearer then. Let's say he does have that belief, that he and Justin have that relationship, and that in fact, Justin would be happy if he were to do this. Justin would like to have this alone time with him, and he's got to murder all these people to do it. Is that delusional?
The part about the relationship with Justin Bieber would be.
Is that an indication of, man, some kind of serious mental illness?
Yes. It
Does?
may be encapsulated. We're talking about maybe delusional disorder in the hypothetical sense. But yes, it would be psychiatrically significant, yeah.
In that hypothetical, does it change the fact that Ed has the capacity to know right from wrong in murdering all those people at the concert?
In my opinion, no, it doesn't change the fact that he has the capacity, or doesn't alter a view about whether or not he has the capacity to know right from wrong.
Does it change the idea that he has the capacity to form the intent to deliberate, after deliberation, of the murder of these people and plan for it in great detail?
Doesn't change it, in my opinion.
One of the other things that is in this DSM-5 is a discussion of beyond delusions, which we touched on, but beyond hallucinations. There are some other symptoms, such as disorganized thinking on page 88. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, did you find any evidence, even after being cross-examined by Mr. King, that the defendant exhibited disorganized thinking prior to the murders of July 20th, 2012?
I didn't see any evidence of any significant disorganized thinking. There may have been some things that were a little disorganized, but overall the thinking was organized, particularly with regard to the mission and with regard to other things that I'm aware that he did.
Well, let's talk about that. Because in this paragraph on 88, you tell me if I'm reading this wrong, it's about in the middle. It says, and let me ask you this. When it talks about disorganized thinking, is one of the hallmarks of that disorganized speech?
It's one of the ways, speech is one of the ways that we infer what's going on in the mind. There are other suggestions, but the simplest way is to listen to how the person talks.
It says, because mildly disorganized speech is common and nonspecific, the symptom must be severe enough to substantially impair effective communication. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
If we were to try to assess whether or not the defendant had disorganized speech leading up to the events of July the 19th and 20th, would you consider, let's say, a recorded third rotation talk in Dr. Freed's lab?
I would think about it. I don't know that it would indicate disorganized speech, but that would be a good thing to listen to at that particular time.
How about the way Dr. Fenton and Feinstein described his thoughts and mannerisms with them when they saw him on June the 11th?
If you include the way to describe his speech, that would be another thing to consider.
Does Dr. Fenton on that June 11th snippet, and we'll get into more detail here in a bit about it, does she describe his thinking as she perceived it on June 11th?
She talks about paranoia, which is a description of the way he thinks. She never, so far as I recall, refers to disorganized thinking or speech.
Doesn't she say logical?
I'm not remembering as I sit here, but if it's there, and I'm sure we can easily find it.
Just like that, some clarification as to when.
Sustained.
June the 11th, 2012?
Objection. Misstates the evidence.
He's asking the question, so that objection is overruled, and I think the doctor has answered that he doesn't know, he doesn't remember.
Do you remember in the conversations with Dr. Fenton and Feinstein on June the 11th, 2012, the defendant clearly telling them his goals as he dropped out of school?
He told them about some goals which they, at that point, accepted.
And there's no indication in those reports that, in your conversations with Dr. Fenton, that he seemed at all disorganized to them.
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
In your conversations with Dr. Fenton and your review of her notes from June 11th, did you find any evidence that he was disorganized in his thoughts or the way that he communicated with them?
Not from what they told me or from the notes.
Mr. Brockler, is this a good time to take our break?
Can I ask one more question and then yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Would another good place to look about the defendant's disorganization in thought and speech be to see how he communicated shortly after this crime?
Yes.
And to that extent, did you review the detailed audio recording between the defendant and Detective Apple and Special Agent Gumberner about the specifics of the incendiaries or explosives in his apartment?
Yes.
In that audio, did you detect any inability for him to communicate clearly information, especially of this sensitive nature?
He appeared to be communicating clearly, answering questions. He understood the point of the questions, was trying to help. No indication of disorganized or irrational thoughts at that point.
Yes.
All right, that was 3 questions, but I'll let it go.
Sorry.
All right, folks, let's go ahead and take our lunch break. It's 1:30. We're going to try to start again at 3:30, but it may be a little late depending on when the juror who has a medical appointment gets back. So please keep in mind all my advisements during the break. All of them apply. Enjoy the lunch break, and I'll see you back here in a couple of hours. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Doctor, you can go on break. Thank you. I don't know if we're going to get to those emails today. Are you anticipating that we will, Mr. Orman?
I don't think we will, Your Honor.
Okay, then let's plan to chat about them at the end of the day, okay?
That's fine. And, well, that'll be 5:30, and I don't mind staying as late as the court wants to. I don't know what the plans were, because we're going with the jury till 5:30, and I know Your Honor also wanted an update sort of on where we are.
We'll talk about that, too. I'm here all the time, so, yeah.
Your Honor, is it possible that we could come back a little early from the break and talk about those issues as opposed to staying later than 5:30? I have some family issues that I have to deal with.
I'm gonna try. I have something that I have to attend during the lunch break. I planned it because I knew we were gonna have a long lunch break, so I'll try. If we don't, is there any way that your colleagues can handle the 2 issues in your absence?
Yes, Judge. I think so. Hold on. They can, Judge, but I'm lead counsel of this part of the case. I'd prefer to be here. If we could do it over the lunch hour, do it Monday morning, would be preferable.
All right, we'll do it during the lunch hour. What time should we plan to come back?
Be here anytime, Your Honor.
All right, why don't we plan to meet back here then at 3? Is a half hour enough time?
I hope so, Your Honor, yes.
How many, have you talked about the emails that are being objected to?
Not, Your Honor.
All right, why don't you do that during the break and see if you can come to any agreements, and then let's have you back at 3 o'clock, and we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about scheduling as well. All right, the court will be in recess. Thank you.